What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors comes face to face with a morning show host who refuses to show even basic respect? In just 33 seconds, George Stephanopoulos would say something so outrageous, so completely out of line, that it would end the interview in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Samuel L. Jackson had agreed to appear on Good Morning America to talk about his latest film project. It was supposed to be a simple promotional interview, the kind actors do dozens of times when they have a new movie coming out. Samuel arrived at the studio early that morning, relaxed and ready to have a good conversation about his work. He had been in the business for decades, handled thousands of interviews, and never had a problem with any host or journalist. He was a professional through and through. The interview began normally enough. George Stephanopoulos welcomed Samuel to the show with his usual polished delivery. The cameras were rolling, the studio lights were bright, and the audience was eager to hear what one of cinema's most iconic voices had to say. Samuel settled into his chair, comfortable and prepared to discuss the new film he had poured his heart into for the past year. George started with what seemed like a standard opening question. "So Samuel, tell us about this new project. What made you want to take on this role?" It was the kind of softball question that typically starts every entertainment interview. Samuel leaned forward, ready to share his passion for the character and the story. "Well, George, this character really spoke to me because he represents something we don't see enough of in cinema," Samuel began. His voice carried that familiar commanding presence that had made him a household name. "He's complex, he's flawed, but he's also deeply human. I wanted to bring authenticity to this role and show audiences something real." But George wasn't really listening. You could see it in his eyes, in the way he glanced down at his notes while Samuel was still speaking. He was waiting for his moment to interrupt, to steer the conversation somewhere else entirely, and before Samuel could finish his thought, George cut him off. "That's interesting, but I actually wanted to ask you about something else," George said, his tone shifting to something more aggressive. "There's been some talk about your career choices lately. Some people are saying you're just taking roles for the paycheck now. What do you say to critics who think you've sold out?" The studio went quiet. Even the crew members exchanged glances. It was a loaded question, the kind designed to create conflict rather than foster genuine conversation. Samuel's expression changed ever so slightly. His jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. He had dealt with difficult questions before, but there was something about the way George asked it that felt personal, almost hostile. "I think anyone who's followed my career knows that I choose projects based on the story and the character," Samuel responded, his voice steady but firm. "I've been doing this long enough to know what I want to do and why I want to do it. I don't owe anyone an explanation for my artistic choices." It was a measured response, professional and dignified. Most hosts would have moved on, perhaps apologized for the harsh framing of the question. But George wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair with a smirk that suggested he was enjoying this confrontation. "Come on, Samuel. You've done what, 3 action movies in the last 2 years? You can't tell me that's all about the art?" George pressed, his voice dripping with condescension. "At some point, doesn't it just become about cashing the check?" Samuel took a deep breath. You could see him choosing his words carefully, trying to give George the benefit of the doubt, trying to assume this was just poorly prepared interview questions rather than intentional disrespect. "George, I've been fortunate enough to work on projects that are both commercially successful and artistically fulfilling," Samuel explained. "Action films can tell powerful stories. They can explore themes of heroism, sacrifice, redemption. Just because something appeals to a wide audience doesn't mean it lacks artistic merit." But George wasn't interested in Samuel's perspective. He shuffled his papers dramatically, making a show of looking through his notes as if he had caught Samuel in some kind of contradiction. "I have it right here that you made $20 million on your last film," George announced, pointing at his notes with theatrical flair. $20 million for what most critics called a mindless explosion fest. How do you justify that kind of paycheck for that kind of movie? The crew behind the camera shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't journalism anymore. This was an ambush. Samuel's eyes narrowed. He sat up straighter in his chair, his body language changing from relaxed to defensive. "How I justify my paycheck?" Samuel repeated, his voice rising slightly. "I don't have to justify anything to you or anyone else. I negotiated a fair rate for my work, and I delivered what was asked of me. The movie was successful. The studio was happy. The fans enjoyed it. Who are you to question what I'm worth?" George laughed. Actually laughed. It was a dismissive, mocking sound that echoed through the studio. "I'm just asking the questions that people want answered," he said with false innocence. "You have to admit, it seems excessive. $20 million to run around and shoot a gun for 2 hours." Samuel's hands gripped the arms of his chair. Anyone who knew him could see the anger building beneath his calm exterior. But he was still trying to maintain his professionalism, still trying to salvage what was quickly becoming a disaster of an interview. "Excessive," Samuel said slowly, letting the word hang in the air. "You want to talk about excessive? Let's talk about your salary, George. How much do you make to sit here and ask condescending questions? Should we put your compensation up for public debate?" The audience gasped. It was a direct hit, a perfect counter to George's attack. But instead of backing down or apologizing, George doubled down. His face flushed red, and his voice took on an edge of genuine anger. "This isn't about me," George snapped. "I'm not the one making ridiculous amounts of money for subpar work. You used to be a serious actor, Samuel. You used to do important films. Now you're just another Hollywood sellout chasing the biggest paycheck." The word sellout hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. It was the ultimate insult to any artist, the suggestion that they had abandoned their principles for money. Samuel's entire body went rigid. His eyes locked onto George's with an intensity that could have melted steel. "Sellout," Samuel repeated, his voice dangerously quiet now. "You're calling me a sellout? You, who reads off a teleprompter every morning for a corporate news organization? You, who asks whatever questions your producers tell you to ask? You're calling me a sellout?" George realized he had pushed too far, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. "I'm just being honest," he said defensively. "Someone has to say what everyone's thinking." "What everyone's thinking," Samuel said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You don't speak for everyone, George. You speak for yourself. And right now, you're speaking like someone who has no respect for the craft, no understanding of the industry, and no business conducting this interview." The tension in the studio was unbearable. Everyone could feel that something was about to break. George, perhaps sensing he was losing control of the situation, tried to redirect with another attack. "Look, I think audiences deserve to know when their favorite actors are just phoning it in for a paycheck," George said. "And based on your recent work, it seems pretty clear that you've stopped caring about quality." That was it. That was the line that should never have been crossed. Samuel had spent his entire career building a reputation as one of the hardest working, most dedicated actors in the business. He had taken roles that challenged him, that scared him, that pushed him to his limits. And now this morning show host, sitting comfortably behind his desk, was suggesting that he didn't care about his work. "Stop caring about quality," Samuel said, his voice now filled with barely contained rage. "You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. None. You sit here in your comfortable chair, reading questions someone else wrote for you, collecting your paycheck, and you have the audacity to question my dedication to my craft?" George opened his mouth to respond, but Samuel wasn't finished. Not even close. "I have spent 40 years perfecting my craft," Samuel continued, his voice rising with each word. 40 years studying characters, learning techniques, pushing myself to be better with every single role. I have worked with the greatest directors in cinema history. I have brought life to characters that have moved millions of people. And you sit here and dismiss all of that because you think you're clever enough to score points with some cheap shots? The crew was frozen. No one dared to move or make a sound. George's face had gone from red to pale. He was clearly not prepared for this level of pushback. He stammered, trying to regain control of the interview. I didn't mean to suggest." George started, but Samuel cut him off immediately. "Yes, you did," Samuel said firmly. "You meant exactly what you said. You planned this. You wanted to create some kind of dramatic moment for your show. You wanted to tear me down to make yourself look good. But here's what you don't understand, George. You can't tear down someone who's built what I've built. You can only expose yourself as someone who doesn't belong in this chair." George's producer was frantically gesturing from off camera, trying to signal him to cut to commercial, to salvage what was left of the interview. But George, in perhaps his biggest mistake of the morning, decided to defend himself. "I think I'm perfectly qualified to ask tough questions," George said, his voice shaking slightly. "And if you can't handle legitimate criticism, maybe you're not as professional as you think you are." Legitimate criticism. Those were the words that sealed it. Samuel stood up slowly, deliberately. He reached up and removed the small microphone that had been clipped to his jacket. The movement was calm, controlled, but everyone in the studio knew what it meant. Legitimate criticism comes from people who understand what they're criticizing, Samuel said, his voice now eerily calm. What you've done here today isn't journalism. It isn't even entertainment. It's just a sad attempt by an insecure host to feel important by attacking someone who's actually accomplished something in their field. George stood up too, perhaps trying to assert some kind of authority. You can't just walk out of an interview, he said, his voice cracking slightly. We're live. Samuel placed the microphone on his chair and looked George directly in the eyes. Watch me, he said simply. The two men stood facing each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. The entire studio held its breath. George tried one last time to salvage his dignity. This is incredibly unprofessional, George said, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. You agreed to come on this show. Samuel smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had just won a battle without even trying. I agreed to come on this show for an interview, he said. What you conducted was an attack. There's a difference. And I don't have to sit here and be disrespected by someone who clearly has no idea what respect even means. George made one final attempt to regain control. Our viewers tuned in to hear from you about your movie, he said, trying to sound reasonable. Don't you owe them that? I owe them honesty, Samuel replied. And honestly, they deserve better than this show. They deserve better than a host who thinks ambushing guests is good television. They deserve better than you, George. With that, Samuel turned and began walking toward the edge of the set. George called after him, his voice now tinged with desperation. Samuel, wait! We can start over. We can talk about the movie. But Samuel didn't even turn around. He raised one hand in a dismissive wave without looking back and continued walking. His stride was confident, unhurried. He wasn't running away. He was choosing to leave. There was a massive difference, and everyone watching understood it perfectly. George stood alone on the set, his face a mixture of shock, anger, and embarrassment. He turned to the camera, trying to salvage something, anything from the disaster he had created. We'll be right back after this break, he stammered, but his voice was shaking. The camera stayed on him for just a moment too long, capturing the full extent of his humiliation. Behind him, you could see Samuel in the background, still walking, his head held high. A production assistant tried to approach him, perhaps to convince him to stay, but Samuel politely but firmly declined, never breaking his stride. The studio erupted into chaos the moment the camera cut away. Producers were shouting, assistants were running around, and George was left standing on the set, alone with the consequences of his actions. He had come into this interview thinking he was going to create a memorable moment of television. He was right about that, but not in the way he had intended. What George failed to understand was that attacking a guest, especially someone of Samuel's caliber and reputation, wasn't brave journalism. It was just bullying. And bullies, when confronted by someone who refuses to be bullied, always end up looking exactly like George looked in that moment. Small, petty, and completely out of their depth. Samuel walked through the backstage area with his head held high. Staff members who had witnessed the exchange nodded at him with respect. Some even gave him quiet words of encouragement. Good for you, one camera operator whispered as Samuel passed. He had that coming, said another. Meanwhile, back on the set, George was in a heated discussion with his producers. They were clearly not happy with how he had handled the interview. Even though the cameras weren't rolling anymore, several crew members could hear parts of the conversation. George was trying to defend himself, insisting that he was just doing his job, asking tough questions, but even his own team seemed to disagree with his approach. Samuel reached his dressing room and gathered his belongings. His phone was already buzzing with messages from his agent, his manager, and several colleagues who had apparently heard what happened. Word traveled fast in the entertainment industry. He took a moment to compose himself, taking a few deep breaths. He wasn't angry anymore. If anything, he felt relieved. Relieved that he had stood up for himself. Relieved that he had refused to participate in the circus George had tried to create. Back in the studio, George was preparing to continue the show after the commercial break, but you could see it in his eyes, in his body language. The confidence was gone. The smugness had evaporated. He knew he had messed up badly. He knew that this moment would be talked about for years to come, and he knew that he would not come out of it looking good. When the show returned from commercial, George made a brief statement. We apologize for the abrupt ending to that segment, he said, his voice lacking its usual authority. We hope to have Samuel L. Jackson back on the show in the future. But everyone watching knew that would never happen. Why would Samuel ever return to a show where he had been so blatantly disrespected? The rest of that episode of Good Morning America was awkward and stilted. George seemed distracted, unable to focus on the remaining segments. His co-host tried to help him recover, but there was no recovering from what had happened. The interview had been the centerpiece of that morning's show, and it had ended in disaster. Samuel, meanwhile, left the building and climbed into his waiting car. As the vehicle pulled away from the studio, he looked back at the building one last time. He had walked into that studio as a guest, ready to promote his work and have a pleasant conversation. He was leaving as someone who had refused to be diminished, who had stood up for his dignity and his career. The driver asked if he was okay. Samuel smiled, a genuine smile this time. "I'm fine," he said. "Better than fine, actually," and he meant it. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in someone else's attempt to tear you down. Sometimes, walking away is the strongest statement you can make. What George failed to grasp in those crucial moments was something that every successful person understands. Respect is not optional. It doesn't matter if you're a morning show host with millions of viewers or a Hollywood actor with decades of experience. Basic human respect should be the foundation of every interaction. When you abandon that respect, when you choose to attack rather than converse, you lose the moral high ground instantly. George had come into that interview with a plan. He wanted to create conflict, to ask provocative questions, to get a reaction. And he got a reaction, just not the one he wanted. He thought Samuel would get defensive, would argue, would create the kind of dramatic back and forth that makes for compelling television. What he didn't expect was for Samuel to simply refuse to play the game, to stand up, remove his microphone, and walk away with his dignity intact. In that moment, Samuel demonstrated something far more powerful than winning an argument. He showed that you don't have to engage with people who are determined to disrespect you. You don't have to fight on their terms. You can simply choose not to participate. It's a lesson that many people never learn, but Samuel had clearly mastered it over his decades in the public eye. The interview, or what was supposed to be an interview, lasted less than 10 minutes from start to finish. But in those 10 minutes, George managed to insult Samuel's career, question his integrity, mock his choices, and generally conduct himself in a manner that would make any journalism professor cringe. And in response, Samuel remained calm, articulate, and ultimately decisive in his choice to leave. There was no yelling match, no throwing of objects, no dramatic threats or ultimatums. Samuel simply explained why George's behavior was unacceptable and then removed himself from the situation. It was dignified, it was powerful, and it left George looking exactly like what he was, a host who had forgotten that his guests were human beings deserving of respect. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been more stark. Samuel, despite being attacked and insulted, never lost his composure. He never stooped to George's level. He never resorted to personal attacks or cheap shots. He simply stated facts, defended his career, and made a choice to leave. George, on the other hand, had become increasingly flustered and defensive, his true colors showing through the veneer of professional broadcaster. What made Samuel's exit even more impactful was the way he did it. There was no storming off, no slamming of doors, no angry gestures or parting shots. He simply stood up, removed his microphone, made his position clear, and walked away. It was the exit of someone who knew their worth, who understood that they didn't need to prove anything to anyone, especially not to a host who had already shown he wasn't interested in a genuine conversation. The power dynamic in that studio had shifted completely. At the start of the interview, George held all the power. It was his show, his set, his audience. He controlled the questions, the timing, the direction of the conversation. But by the end, Samuel held all the power. He decided when the interview was over. He determined what he would and would not tolerate. He took control of the situation by refusing to be controlled. As Samuel's car drove through the streets, away from the studio, he reflected on what had just happened. He didn't regret his decision for a second. If anything, he felt proud that he had stood up for himself. In an industry where people often feel pressured to smile through disrespect, to endure insults for the sake of promotion, Samuel had drawn a line, and in doing so, he had sent a message not just to George, but to everyone watching. Your dignity is not negotiable. The interview that was supposed to promote Samuel's new film had become about something much bigger. It became about respect, about professionalism, about knowing when to walk away. George had wanted to create a memorable television moment, and he succeeded. But the moment that people would remember wasn't his clever questions or his supposed tough journalism. It was the moment when a respected actor said, "Enough is enough," and walked out the door. In the dressing rooms and hallways of that television studio, staff members were still talking about what they had witnessed. Many of them had worked in television for years and had never seen anything quite like it. They had seen awkward interviews, sure. They had seen guests who were difficult or unprepared, but they had never seen a host so thoroughly lose control of an interview through his own actions. They had never seen someone mishandle a situation so completely. George, sitting in his dressing room after the show ended, must have been replaying the interview in his mind, must have been wondering where it all went wrong. But the truth was, it went wrong the moment he decided that attacking his guest was more important than having a conversation. It went wrong when he chose confrontation over curiosity. It went wrong when he forgot that the person sitting across from him was not just a celebrity to be taken down a peg, but a human being with feelings, accomplishments, and dignity. Samuel's phone continued to buzz with messages. Colleagues from across the industry were reaching out, expressing support, sharing their own stories of difficult interviews and disrespectful hosts. The entertainment community, it seemed, was rallying around him, because everyone in that industry knew how hard it was to maintain your dignity in the face of someone determined to undermine you. Everyone had been in situations where they felt disrespected, but felt pressured to smile through it. Samuel's walkout had been cathartic not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been in a similar position. The interview, though it had ended badly for George, had revealed something important about both men. It had shown Samuel to be someone of principle, someone who knew his worth and wouldn't compromise it for anyone. And it had shown George to be someone who mistook aggression for journalism, who confused disrespect for toughness. In trying to make himself look important by diminishing Samuel, George had only succeeded in diminishing himself. As the day went on and the story spread, people began weighing in with their opinions, and the vast majority of those opinions supported Samuel's decision to walk out. People understood that he hadn't been throwing a tantrum or being difficult. He had been standing up for himself in the face of unwarranted attacks. He had been drawing a reasonable boundary and enforcing it when that boundary was violated. What George never seemed to understand, either during the interview or perhaps even after, was that tough questions and disrespectful questions are not the same thing. A tough question challenges someone to think deeply, to explain their choices, to defend their positions with logic and evidence. A disrespectful question assumes the worst, attacks character, and seeks to humiliate rather than illuminate. George had crossed from tough to disrespectful within the first few minutes of the interview, and he had never found his way back. Samuel, reflecting on the experience later in his car, understood something that George didn't. He understood that every person, regardless of their profession or their paycheck, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. He understood that agreeing to do an interview doesn't mean agreeing to be insulted. He understood that sometimes the most professional thing you can do is recognize when a situation has become unproductive and remove yourself from it. The interview had been scheduled to last 15 minutes. It had lasted less than 10. But in those 10 minutes, more had been revealed about professionalism, respect, and dignity than most hour-long interviews ever reveal. George had learned the hard way that you cannot treat people poorly and expect them to simply accept it. Samuel had demonstrated that standing up for yourself doesn't require aggression or drama. It just requires clarity about your boundaries and the courage to enforce them. As Samuel's car continued through the city, he thought about the movie he had been there to promote, the film that George had barely let him discuss, the project he had poured his heart into. It didn't matter that the interview had ended badly. The film would stand on its own merits. His fans would see it, critics would review it, and his career, built over 40 years of dedication and hard work, would continue unaffected by one disastrous morning show interview. George, meanwhile, would have to face the consequences of his actions. His producers were undoubtedly unhappy. His network executives would want explanations, and his reputation had taken a serious hit, all because he had forgotten the most basic rule of interviewing: treat your guests with respect. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't difficult. It was simply the right thing to do. And George had failed to do it. The story of what happened in that studio would be told and retold in the days and weeks to come. It would become a cautionary tale about the importance of respect, about the dangers of letting ego override professionalism, about what happens when you underestimate the person sitting across from you. And at the center of that story would be two men, one who knew his worth and defended it, and one who learned too late that disrespect has consequences. Samuel arrived at his next destination, ready to move forward with his day. The interview was behind him, the decision had been made, and he had no regrets, because at the end of the day, he had remained true to himself. He had refused to be diminished. He had walked away with his head held high. And sometimes, that's all you can do. Sometimes, that's everything.